So today's notes are on completing the square. Our content objective is to solve equations or solve and rewrite equations by completing the square, and our language objective is to use the correct terminology to explain how to do that. So before we jump into that process, I want to review something that's sort of essential to that process that we'll get to later. But I want to solve the quadratic equation 4x squared plus 10 equals 46. So notice here there is no term with a plain x or no b value. So when I encounter problems like this, I can just solve this like it's a normal algebraic equation. So the way I'm going to solve this is first by isolating x squared. So I have 4x squared plus 10 equals 46. In order to isolate x squared, I'm going to first move 10. I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides, and I get 4x squared equals 36. I'm going to divide both sides by 4, and I get x squared equals 9. Then I'm going to square root both sides. And I get x squared equals plus or minus 3. So one thing I want to note, your solution when you take a square root can be positive or negative. And this is because, for example, if we had 3 times 3, we get 9. But we also can multiply negative 3 by negative 3 and get 9. So the square root of 9 could be positive or negative 3. So I need to account for both of those scenarios. So this is going to be really essential for the rest of the unit. Whenever you take a square root, you need to account for both a positive or negative solution. So the positive is the principal root, the one that we're used to solving for, but we also need to account for the negative root because a lot of our quadratics will have more than one x-intercept and more than one solution. And we're going to get that other solution through the negative root or negative square root. So with that in mind, let's do some quick checks really fast to make sure you guys are okay with this process. So number 1, we have 3x squared minus 5 equals 25. Number 2, we have 7x squared minus 10 equals 25 again. All right, let's try those out. I'm going to go over them now. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides. Get 3x squared equals 30. Divide both sides by 3. And I get x squared equals 10. Square root both sides, and I get x equals the square root of 10. And that could be plus or minus. So I'm going to put the plus or minus in front so I remember that that root could be positive or negative, and that's my answer. The next one, I'm going to start by adding 10 to both sides. So I get 7x squared equals 35. Divide both sides by 7. I get x squared equals 5. Square root both sides. I get x equals plus or minus the square root of 5. So that is my answer for that one. Sorry, I did not show you that work. My bad. So make sure you check your answers on this. Write down any questions, comments, or concerns. The last thing I want to note on this page is when there's no I said this, but I wanted to write it down. When there is no plain x or no term with a b value, just solve like a normal equation. So what I find is a lot of times students get caught up in trying to figure out what they should do in a situation like our last examples. If there's no b value, you can just solve this like a normal equation. If you recognize it's the difference of squares, you can solve that way as well. But oftentimes, if there's no b value, just solve this like a normal equation and you'll get your answer, no problem. The reason I'm emphasizing this, I'm going to flip the page, is because what we're going to do in this next process is basically create a situation where we no longer have a plain x. so that we can solve like we've been solving in those last examples. So our example we're going to work with now asks us to solve x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals 25. So I show you this one first because last time we solved with no b value. Now we're going to solve a problem where we can recognize a perfect square trinomial. I'll get to that more in a second. But so what we're ultimately going to do completing the square is combine those two processes to complete the square. So we're going to create a perfect square trinomial, then solve when there's no b value. But before we get there, let's practice this one. So our first step here, we can recognize that this is a perfect square trinomial. So if you've forgotten how to do that, you could also just factor this. So I'm going to say, even though it's not equal to 0, I'm going to say recognize the perfect square trinomial. So that's x squared plus 4x plus 4. So you know that's a perfect square trinomial because if you divide or take the square root of the first, square root of the second, so x, so square root of x squared is x, square root of 4 is 2, 2x times 2 is 4x. That matches our middle term, so I recognize that it's a perfect square trinomial. If you didn't recognize that, that's all right because we will learn a process by which it won't really matter. So then I'm going to factor it. So I'm going to factor this. So when I factor it, I know it's going to factor 2x, since the middle term is plus 2 squared equals 25. So if you didn't recognize that it was a perfect square trinomial, you can still factor this. I know you just find factors of c that add to b since their a value is 1. So find factors of c that add to b, you have your factors. Either way, once you get to this step, whatever method you use to get there, as long as you get to this step, then what's going to work here is like what we just did. We're going to solve for x just like a normal algebraic equation. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So I square root both sides and I get x plus 2 equals plus or minus 5. And I'm going to set up two equations and solve for x. So I'm going to set up two equations and solve for x. So I have x plus 2 equals 5, x plus 2 equals negative 5, and I'm going to solve each of those. So I get x equals 3, x equals negative 7, and those will be my two solutions, my two x-intercepts. So the key thing I want you to note here is if you create a perfect square trinomial where you can write a binomial square, because you know that's how perfect square trinomials always will factor, they'll factor to a binomial square, then you can solve like we were just solving in our last examples, where you can just square root both sides and solve out like a normal algebraic equation. So that's what the process completing the square is going to do. It's going to create a perfect square trinomial that will factor to a binomial square, and then we can solve out just like we were solving out in normal, like solving a normal algebraic equation. So let's do one of those examples now. So we're going to do the full process of completing the square from start to finish. So what is the solution of 3x squared minus 12x plus 6 equals 0? So that's our quadratic we're going to solve. So here, this time our first step is going to be to move our c value. So move the c value to the other side. So I'm just going to subtract 6 from both sides. I'm not going to show that step just for the sake of, actually, so I had 3x squared minus 12x plus 6 equals 0. I subtract 6 from both sides. I get 3x squared minus 12x equals negative 6. So there's my first step. Now I'm going to get a to be 1, or divide everything by a. So I want my a value to be 1 for this to work, so I'm always going to divide by a. If a is already 1, you don't need to do this step. But if a is not 1, you should divide by a to make this easier. So you divide by a, you get x squared minus 4x equals negative 2. So I divide by a, just so you remember, so that a equals 1. So you want your a value to be 1 for this process. It'll make it a lot easier. So you divide everything by a if a is not 1. Now we're good. This is where the tricky step comes in. So now we're going to find b over 2. So b over 2, b is equal to negative 4. So if I do b over 2, that's going to be negative 2. So I'm going to circle this value for a second because it's going to be important. This is going to become the number in the binomial that's going to be squared. So I got negative 2, so I'm going to write x minus 2 squared. So I already know that this is going to be my binomial, or my binomial squared. So I'm going to make a little note of that. That's where that ends up. The next thing I'm going to do is find b over 2 squared. So b over 2 squared is going to be just negative 2 squared, which is positive 4. So it becomes positive 4. And then I'm going to add that to both sides. When I say that, I mean both sides here. So you're going to add it here and here. You end up with x squared minus 4x plus 4 equals negative 2 plus 4. This factors here, and then this becomes your other side. So this becomes 2. So I want to note that this just goes into your binomial. You add b over 2 squared to both sides, and that gives you what goes on the other side of the equation. It ends up not showing up when you write the perfect squared, or when you write your binomial squared, because this is what you needed to get in order for it to factor to a perfect square binomial. So I just want to note we added it to both sides, but it doesn't show up in this step of the process because it doesn't show up when we factor it. So we added b over 2 squared to both sides mathematically, but it doesn't show up in this part of the equation. Then we're just going to solve like normal. So then I'm going to square root both sides. So I have x minus 2 squared equals 2. I square root both sides. I get x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 2. I can't take the square root of 2. It's not a pretty square root, so I just add 2 to both sides, and I get x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 2. And that is my final answer. All right. We'll go over some more of these in class. If you want to do a quick check, I will write one right here for you. If you want to try one last one out, I'll write it really tiny. But if you're all set for now, you can log off. You're all good to go. That's our notes for today. But our quick check will be solve 2x squared plus 16x plus 14 equals 0. So solve that one if you want the quick check. If not, you can go. I'm going to go over it now. So you divide everything by, or you move c. You get 2x squared plus 16x equals negative 14. You divide everything by 2. You get x squared plus 8x equals negative 7. You do 8 over 2 and get 4. So you're going to have x plus 4 squared equals, then you do 4 squared is 16, and you're going to add that to negative 7, and you end up with x plus 4 squared equals 9. And then you can keep solving out. I'm out of space, so I'm going to stop for now, but that would, then you could solve that, square root both sides. Add 4, you end up getting negative 1 and negative 7. But I'm going to stop there. Make sure you write down any questions, comments, or concerns you have so we can go over them together in class.